Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's WFRN virtual conference series event using ATUS data to investigate work, family, and well-being before and during the pandemic. I'm Jen Hook, WFRN's Vice President, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this event on behalf of WFRN's leadership team, our President Ellen Galinsky, our Executive Director Stephen Sweet. I also want to recognize the sponsorship of the Population Research Institute at Penn State. Before introducing our speakers, I want to acknowledge that by joining us today, you are consenting to recording. The recording will be posted on WFRN's website for those who can't join us in person today. I want to also acknowledge that events are made possible by the generous support of our members. If you're not a member yet, I encourage you to check out our website and learn more about WFRN and the benefits of membership. We'll pop the link into the chat. And finally, please save the date for our in-person conference on June 20th to 22nd in Montreal on the theme Big Questions in Work and Family. Submission is open and closes November 1st. And look for our next virtual conference series event coming Thursday, January 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern, which will feature a panel discussion on work-family perspectives on low fertility in East Asia. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Today, Sarah Flood is the director of the Life Course Center at the University of Minnesota and director of U.S. Survey Projects at IPUMS. Her research interests lie at the intersection of gender, work, and family, aging in the life course, and time use. Her current projects examine the time use of retirement age Americans, time allocation patterns of men and women with different work-family configurations, and momentary assessments of subjective well-being. Liana is director of the Maryland Time Use Laboratory and professor of sociology at the University of Maryland and editor of the Journal of Marriage and Family. Her current projects are focused on testing new methods of collecting and analyzing time use data and investigating continuity and change in the joint influences of gender, race, ethnicity, and social class on time use across the life course. And with that, I will turn it over to Liana.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for inviting us to talk about IPUMS time use, something that we are always happy to do. The focus of our talk today is going to be on using the American Time Use Survey and well-being data to study gender, work, family during and before the pandemic. I'm going to share my screen now. And okay. All right. So is that good? Okay. All right. So we have already gone through that. And okay. So Sarah and I are going to do a bit of a tag team show. I'm going to start off with just some general information on why we might want to think about COVID influences on gender, work, family. Many of you are likely familiar with these. And then what we'll do is talk specifically about using both the time use data and the well-being data to study these topics. So we know from survey data that most people think their lives have changed because of COVID-19. This is from the Pew Research Center, and it's showing for 4 countries, the US, UK, France, and Germany, the percentage who say their life has changed, and the large proportions of individuals report that their lives changed a great deal, and you've got majorities saying it changed a fair amount or a great deal. Now, this was collected in fall 2020, early on in the pandemic. So we might think about 2 things: what was going on during that period and how that might be filtering into other experiences of time use during the day. This is again from Pew, and it's showing the growing share of US workers who are working a hybrid schedule. This is more recent data. It's 2023. During the early days of the pandemic, people who could work at home were working at home totally. We've now kind of transitioned to some people are still working at home all of the time, but we have fewer of those people today. And then we have hybrid workers working at home either most of the time, some of the time, or rarely or never. And this is a very interesting statistic here, this never statistic, given that we've seen little movement of this over this period. And this was a fairly rare experience before this working at home was much more, never working at home, let me get my words straight, was much more common before the pandemic than it is now. And one reason we might think about the continued dominance of either hybrid or working at home all the time comes from this chart here that shows us why people might be interested in it. And they're interested in it because it helps people balance their work and their personal life. Something I think people who work in academics certainly were familiar with before the pandemic. All right, now the shift to remote work might be a good thing, but we also have very alarming levels of mental distress that might or might not be linked with the pandemic itself. And what I want to highlight here, this is again from Pew data, is this gender difference. We see that women, close to 50%, are more likely than men to say they experienced high levels of psychological distress in at least one of the four surveys that were collected in 2020. And women have a slightly higher proportion in high distress in September of 22. But we also know that psychological distress fluctuated a bit over the time period. You also see some evidence from this data, as called out in the headline, that young adults were more likely to experience high psychological distress compared to older adults, in particular, those 65 and older. All right. And then these are just types of distress that people might experience, even if they're not in high distress. We've got a fair number of people who experienced at least some problems sleeping, feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, depression, or loneliness. Fewer, though, who had a physical reaction when they were thinking about COVID itself. All right, so these are all reasons that we might want to think about using the time use data and the well-being data in particular to look at experiences of gender, work, and family during the pandemic, and then think about how that might have changed from before the pandemic. So what we'll do now is give you a general overview to how you might approach looking at gender, work, and family before and during COVID with the data. Okay, so we'll start off with a general introduction to IPUMS, then IPUMS Time Use, shows some of the highlights from our own research on using the data to study the topic, and then take your questions. All right, so what is IPUMS? IPUMS is a fabulous tool that is 30 years old at this point. I believe the 30-year anniversary was celebrated last Friday, if I'm remembering that right. And so IPUMS overall is a repository of U.S. and international census and survey data. It has funding from a variety of sources, and the idea of IPUMS is to improve data accessibility. And the way that the IPUMS folks go about doing this is by providing excellent documentation that is integrated into the data archives and standardized data that makes it very easy for researchers to quickly start their analysis. It reduces the learning curve considerably. The data are available free of charge, and they are easy to access and easy to use, thanks to the genius of Stephen Ruggles. IPUMS has a vast amount of data from U.S. and international surveys on a variety of topics. They've got the CPS data, a lot of international data, health data, and geographic data, more geographic data, I believe, and then time use, which is the topic of our discussion today. All right, now the IPUMS model is to provide data and documentation that is integrated into their web-based dissemination system. And what researchers do when they visit IPUMS, they register, and then this unlocks everything for them, basically. And from there, what people can do is create customized data sets, so they get only the years they want, only the variables they need for their analysis. And the system sets up the extract exactly as specified by the researcher. It's always also very easy to go back and modify your extract if you find out that at some point, a couple of weeks later, you really needed a variable. You can go back and add it back in quite easily. And then what you do is download the data, and you can analyze it using the package of your choice, because IPUMS provides the syntax necessary for Stata, for SAS, for R. All right. And then there is plenty of user support that you can use either on your own, or you can seek support from their dedicated user support team. All right. So now focusing on IPUMS time use, what we have here is a middle-aged project, which seems totally appropriate. And this is the first structurally complex data available via IPUMS. And the time use data are pretty challenging to use on your own, far less challenging if you get them through IPUMS Time Use. And we have been fortunate to be funded by NICHD since 2006. All right, so this is our team. Catherine Abraham here at University of Maryland, a preeminent economist, and the person who was heading the Bureau of Labor Statistics and really led a lot of the development of the American Time Use Survey, and then was the PI on the first grant with the folks from Minnesota. Stephen Ruggles, who's at IPUMS, a former president of the Population Association of America. He may have held other offices, but most notably, he is a recognized genius by the MacArthur Foundation. And then Jonathan Gershuni, who's at the Center for Time Use Research, who came on board when we being the PIs on the project decided that the international data would be a major boon for the data deposited at IPUMS Time Use. So those three really got the project started. And this is our current team: myself, Sarah Flood, and Dan Backman at IPUMS, and then Juana Lamotte de Grian Perez, who is our contact and really essential to keep the work going internationally at CTOR. All right. So what are time diary surveys? They are very simplistically structured narrative accounts of recent daily events. The convention in the United States has been to collect these for 24-hour periods. And what you wind up with is episode level data on everything people are doing during that 24-hour period. And you also have very good contextual data that you can use to glean what they were experiencing, because you have data on not just what they were doing, but where they were doing it, with whom they were doing it. And then in certain years, you have other contextual data. And these are available in various modules or sometimes integrated in the surveys themselves. There is a fair amount of interest, as we'll talk today, in how people are feeling during activities, their momentary affect or emotions, which you can use to get at their experienced well-being. And then, are they using some type of smart device during the activity? Time diary surveys are suited to large sample surveys, but they retain some of the benefits of qualitative narratives, because you can examine not just what people were doing, you can examine the flow of activities across the diary day and see how that flow interconnects with the contextual data. All right, so IPUMS Time Use provides easy access to the years of data that researchers need. It is harmonized across time and across countries, which saves tremendous amounts of time figuring out the original surveys. And you can create user-defined measures of time in specific activity aggregations. So you've got the ability quite easily to use time use variables that are exactly like the ones disseminated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or are exactly like ones that you might need for your particular research question. And those variables will be there, and then you can pull them into other analyses or tweak them if you find that you need to do that. You receive both data set and variable level documentation in one place, linked to your variables plus variable level frequencies. So you can easily figure out, well, do I have enough sample to look at this particular question? And then, as I mentioned, you have data in multiple formats. All right. So let's just talk briefly about harmonization and why it is so important. Harmonization, the idea of it is that you want to create a single consistent data series from data sets collected at different time points. And what you do is apply a coding scheme to group broadly comparable categories, but retain additional data when available. This gives researchers the ability to use the harmonized data that's typically less disaggregated, or if they don't need all that harmonization over time or over space, they can make use of the additional data. And it is essential, really, for harmonization to clarify what's been done and why to users, to document all the decisions and flag any potential comparability issues. So let's just talk briefly about changes to detail in the American Time Use Survey activity code, something that is pretty difficult to figure out from the user guide for each year if you were to not go through IPUMS to get the data. Okay, so this is work-related travel, not commuting. And in 2003 and 2004, we see that this has the same code, and it's got a different label, though. This is work-related travel, not commuting. This is travel related to work-related activities. They don't necessarily mean a change in what the activity represents, but they might indicate that. And so IPUMS is able to use their software to line up the activity code categories with the same meaning, assign them the same codes and the same level. And then here we see that these have different codes in 2004 and 2005. They've got the exact same label. So again, the software would line these up and make them have the same code in IPUMS Time Use. So this is a pretty simple example intended to illustrate what harmonization is. Sarah can probably provide some other examples if you're curious about those. This is relevant, though, both to the US data making sure that it's comparable over time, and then also to the international data. Okay. All right. And then this shows what the outcome here is. You've got data from 2003, 2020, all in that code. All right. Okay. So IPUMS time use, we've given the link here if you want to access the data. There is cross-sectional survey and time diary data from 2003 to the present. And the American Time Use Survey is collected from the outgoing rotation of the current population survey. You get updated data on certain items at the time of the ATUS interview, which is 3 to 5 months after the last CPS interview. For the ATUS, there is one person age 15 and older per household selected at random, and they do a computer-assisted interview conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then they release annual data in summer of each year. So if you're interested in the 2023 data, that would be coming out summer of 2024, and IPUMS is able to get it up quite quickly after BLS releases it. And then we have occasional supplements with very focused items, the eating and health module. There is a new module underway now. There are 2 earlier eating and health modules. There are 2 leave modules now, and there's 1 planned for 2025 or 24. I can't remember. And then the well-being module, which was collected at 2 points, one during the pandemic, and we'll be talking more extensively about it. IPUMS ATUS is the primary source for annual estimates of population time allocation, and you can also use the data to examine population subgroups. So just to recap some of what I've said, you get data on what, when, where, and with whom Americans spend time. You have excellent temporal scope, 2003 forward, annual data. You have detailed information, not just about respondents, but household members, their sociodemographic characteristics, the household structure, employment status, education, income, and you have large nationally representative samples that gives you the ability to look at population subgroups and to a limited extent to look at sub-state geography. You have more ability to look at state variation in patterns of time use. Okay. All right. So these are the benefits of the American Time Use Survey. All of these are quite relevant even before a pandemic, but maybe more so during the pandemic because of the ways that that sharply disrupted people's daily routines, their patterns of interaction, and perhaps their emotional well-being. So we were fortunate to be able to field a collection that gives us the ability to see how experience well-being, to study that during the pandemic itself with the 2021 well-being module of the ATUS, and then compare it with this earlier module that was collected in 2010 and then 2012 and 2013. Both of these surveys are identical, and they give you experienced emotions in activities, 3 randomly selected activities, and you get data on their experienced happiness, meaning, sadness, stress, pain, and fatigue. And these were supported from, this was supported by the National Institutes of Aging, and the 2021 supported by grants from NICHD and the National Science Foundation. All right. So one way to think about time use is that you're getting data on people's everyday behavior And we want to study that everyday behavior because it tells us about pathways through which the social and economic contexts that people are embedded in are associated with health inequities. And associated with inequities when we think about gender and work and family issues more broadly. So time use data can help us understand, as scientists, major public health challenges like the pandemic, but also factors that were present before the pandemic and are likely to still be major public health issues after the pandemic, like social isolation and subjective well-being. You can also use them to study other topics that we don't have time today, like sleep, for example. And time use data can also be really helpful for policy context and understanding broad population behavior, because it really is revealing about the complex relationships between social, economic, different policy context, and you can use all of that to study how things are changing for large population groups. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Sarah now, and I will try and keep up with you in terms of advancing the slides.
Thanks, Liana. So we've gotten an overview about why we should care about time use during the pandemic, and a little bit about IPUMS and the American Time Use Survey. Now we're going to drill down and talk more specifically about the data. So what you're seeing here is the homepage for accessing American Time Use Survey data through IPUMS. And I just want to bring your attention to the big Get Data button near the bottom left. That's where you go to locate data and start creating a data extract that you can download and analyze. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's in the American Time Use Survey time diary? As Liana said, it's a 24-hour time diary. This spans the 4 a.m. period of yesterday until 4 a.m. today. And there's a 6-digit activity coding scheme, which represents more than 400 detailed activities. The documentation that the BLS provides and that we make available on our website shows you the kinds of things that people reported that got coded into these 400 plus activities. There's also good information on the co-presence of other people. So the question asks specifically, who was in the room with you? And there's detailed information on which household members were there, you know, the ages of those household members, the gender, and you also know who was there, even if they don't live with the respondent. So detailed information on both household and non-household members who the respondent could report being with during an activity. You know the location and mode of transportation. So you can look at time spent at home, at work, at someone else's home, or in public more generally, outdoors. And you can also disaggregate the data by the type of transportation that people were using. So were they using an active form of transportation like walking or biking, or were they on a train, in a car, even a ferry is an option in the data. And then finally, along with the time diary, there's limited information on multitasking, which a lot of people are interested in. But with these data, you know whether people were engaged in secondary childcare during the activity, secondary elder care, or secondary eating and drinking. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of the instrument that interviewers use to collect the data. I just want to sort of underscore here that the data are complex because people are reporting every single activity they're reporting. So you can see down towards the bottom that the diary starts at 4 a.m. The first activity here was sleeping, and they were sleeping for 8 hours, and they woke up at noon, and then they ate something, and that took an hour, and then they played with kids, and they were grooming, and again, who they were with and where they were as well. So these are really rich data. Next slide, please. Here's another example of the of what a time diary looks like, and this just takes you from 4 a.m. to noon. And I want to point out here that while there's information about where people are and who they're with during most activities, they don't collect location and who with information for activities like sleep and personal care, because these are sensitive activities. But they do collect information about who you're with and where you are for most activities. Next slide, please. Liana mentioned this briefly, but the sampling frame for the American Time Use Survey is the current population survey. The CPS is the labor force survey from which unemployment statistics are generated every month. And once people rotate out of the CPS, they're eligible to participate in the American Time Use Survey. And you can see the little figure here at the bottom that not everyone who was in the CPS is invited to participate in the time use survey, but a subset of people are. And the beauty of this design for researchers is that we have a lot of information about the respondent and members of their household. You can even link back in time to look at transitions, for example, transitions into parenthood, transitions into widowhood or divorce that are occurring over the CPS panel. And then you can look at people who are experiencing these transitions versus who might have been in that state for a longer period of time. All right, next slide, please. We're not going to talk in any more depth about the current population survey than this single slide. I'm happy to talk about it later if there are questions. But like I said, these are this is the survey from which unemployment statistics are generated every month. There's detailed information on demographics, labor force participation and unemployment, as well as educational attainment. And the CPS is a short-term panel. People are observed 8 times over a 16-month period. So when I talked about being able to examine transitions, if someone experiences a transition, for example, into parenthood over that 16-month period, you would observe a child entering the household in the CPS. The CPS also has supplemental data collection on a very regular basis. So there's information about volunteering. There's a new supplement coming out on work schedules. Everyone's interested in work schedules now. The last time it was fielded, I believe, was 2004. So those data will be very exciting. And there's a supplement on food security, tobacco use. Anyway, you can link all of this information to the American Time Use Survey, which really gives you a richer set of data. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so back to the American Time Use Survey. The American Time Use Survey sample is split evenly between weekends and weekdays. And the idea here is to make sure that there are enough weekend days to be able to generate reliable estimates. And so 10% of respondents respond on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And then 25% of the sample responds on a Sunday and 25% on a Saturday, as you can see below. Next slide, please. I also want to just remind you that this is a one-day time diary. So people respond once and not again. And so you might observe them on a Monday, but you will not observe them on any other day. The idea with the data is that when we pool the days together, we can generate population estimates of time use, even if we can't look at differences within individuals across days. So some of the opportunities for research with the American Time Use Survey as related to the pandemic and gender, work, and family, you can examine what, when, where, and with whom Americans do things before, during, and after the pandemic. So for example, thinking about parental time use, we know that there's a gender difference in the amount of time that parents, mothers, and fathers spend with children. What happened during the pandemic? Did these differences shrink? Did they grow? Did they stay the same? What about gendered housework, right? We know that more people were spending time at home. Did this even out the gender division of labor in housework activities or physical activity? If you're not spending time commuting, how are people spending that time? Are they sort of investing in themselves and engaging in more physical activity? We can also look at, and this I think is one of the really powerful things about the American Time Use Survey compared to other data collections that sprung up during the pandemic, is that you can look at change, right? We have good baselines, right? Almost 17 years of data on time use of Americans prior to the pandemic. And so once the pandemic hits, we have a good idea of how people were spending their time before the pandemic. And so during that pandemic period, we can attribute at least some of that change in behavior to the pandemic. The same is true for subjective well-being, because the well-being data attached to the American Time Use Survey were collected prior to the pandemic, and we were able to get the module into the field in 2021. Again, we have good data from a decade ago about people's well-being, and we can look at change. There are also lots of other opportunities. You could look at stay-at-home orders and link these to the American Time Use Survey. This is possible because we have states and we have exact days of interviews. And so, right, you can know what was the state of affairs in the state where that person lived on their diary day. You could also link COVID infection rates to the data or occupational characteristics because we have detailed occupations. So there are lots of opportunities to use the American Time Use Survey both on its own and in combination with other data to think about how COVID affected people's time use. And now I'm turning it back over to Liana quickly. Liana, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the research we've been doing to look at a few of those questions that Sarah just mentioned. Let me start by orienting you to this slide. This is showing change in parents' childcare and housework before and during the pandemic. So we've got 2019, 2020, and 2021. And I can tell you a little bit about 2022 if people have questions about that later. So this is showing for mothers and for fathers. And then the red coefficients are indicating significant gender differences, and the bold coefficients are indicating if the difference is significant over time comparing to 2019. So not surprisingly, most of these are significantly different for mothers and fathers across the period, except interestingly for this developmental childcare time in 2021, where mothers and fathers are spending comparable amounts of time on developmental activities for their children. Developmental childcare activities are teaching, playing, reading to children, activities that child development scholars believe build children's capabilities broadly, as opposed to more physical types of childcare that we see mothers continuing to do about twice as much in. we did not see significant change in mothers' overall child care. You saw an initial jump in mothers' developmental child care of 14 minutes a day, but then it declined to the level it was in 2019. And this is the same pattern that we see for fathers here. What did really increase markedly is secondary childcare and time spent with children for fathers. So secondary increase for both. So secondary childcare went up for mothers in 2020, early on in the pandemic, and then declined a bit. And you also see the same pattern for fathers. And then time with children increased, or time with children did not increase for mothers, but it did increase for fathers, but significantly only in 2020, when fathers were likely spending a little bit more time at home. And we don't really see a lot of movement in fathers' housework, unlike some of the other surveys that were collected during the pandemic. We actually see an initial increase that's significant, but then a fallback, and not much going on for mothers itself. So, this is a little bit surprising when we think about it, in that the time use patterns, we see some initial shifts, but then by 2021, people are spending time in ways that's pretty comparable to pre-pandemic. It's surprising when you first look at it, but then when you think about it, this was a period when life was changed more dramatically. It was a sudden shock. People were at home, but by 2021, people living in many places in the country were resuming their life in similar ways to how they were spending their lives before the pandemic, albeit they might have been doing different things like masking and being more careful. And so, given the rise in remote work, there is a lot of interest in seeing, well, if we look at childcare and housework, the exact same data that I showed you in the earlier slide for the same period, do we see different patterns? Maybe mothers who are working only at home or in some type of hybrid arrangement, or aren't doing paid work on the diary day, or aren't employed. Do we see any differences across these groups here? And you do see some interesting changes, but again, you don't see marked increases in childcare itself for mothers who are working only at home, or those who are engaged in some hybrid arrangement. In fact, you see mothers in 2020 who weren't able to spend all their time at home. They're doing slightly less childcare compared to when they were before. It's really mothers who are not reporting work on the diary day, and those who are not employed are the ones who consistently are doing more childcare compared to mothers who work at home, or are working in some type of hybrid arrangement. And we see this pattern less so for secondary and with whom time when we compare these two groups, paid work at home and no paid work on the diary day. One, I think, interesting thing that you can explore with the diary data itself that I haven't had time to look at yet is for this group here. These are mothers who are employed. They're just not reporting any paid work on the diary day. Well, that diary day could be a day when their child has school. And you can determine, okay, is it a weekday, and are they in a state and at a time point when their child is likely to be at home with them? And maybe they're supervising school. This could be picking up some of that time, because is the child around? What time of day this is, and the type of day it is. So there's a lot more that can be done with the diary data. This chart has way too much information in it. But even with that, you can drill down and really say, that looks interesting. And I can use the time use data to figure out to a better extent what might be going on with this pattern, that you see it also for mothers who aren't employed, but you don't see it for those who are working only at home. All right. And then the last slide that I will be presenting here is from some other work I'm doing looking at leisure time. So this was motivated in part by the idea that during the pandemic, we could have seen an increase in leisure activities, perhaps leisure activities that were associated with being outside, engaged in physical activities. And it was also motivated by my longstanding interest in gender differences in leisure time. It's showing the trend over a longer period of time from 2003 to 2021 for men and for women, and then broken down by, are you married with a child, married, no children, single with children, and single without a child. And what we see here is a pretty similar pattern across these groups for men and for women. Not surprisingly, married mothers with children, or married mothers, have the lowest amount of leisure consistently. It bumps up a little bit in 2021 compared to the earlier period. We don't really see a comparable increase in married fathers' leisure. But during the pandemic itself, what we see is an increase in the amount of leisure time that single fathers experience and single men without children. And again, you could look at co-presence, you could look at what they're doing, where they're doing it, to get a better understanding of exactly what's going on here and why you might not have seen that same pattern hold for single mothers, because here we see that we don't see an increase in single mothers' leisure. Instead, we see a decrease that's likely coming from some of the same factors I was just talking about, needing to be there for your child's schooling, for example. All right, so Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, this is a paper that I worked on with my colleague Katie Genetic, and this paper is an analysis of individuals 18 and older who worked on the ATUS Diary Day, and the focus is really on changes in where people worked between 2019 and 2021, and it was partially motivated by just lots of attention in the media to remote work, and thinking about, who is able to work at home and who's not able to work at home, right? We know this. We can see this in our friends, and we have these experiences, but we really wanted to, have some data behind this issue related to remote work. And so we don't have information on where do people usually work, but we're using on the day that they responded, where did they spend the majority of their work time? And so let's see, there are 4 figures here. The top left is showing differences in the percent of men and women working primarily at home between 2019 and 2021. The red line is men, the blue line is women. And so what you can see is that actually more women than men were working at home in 2020. The gap got a little bit larger. And then we see some declines for women in 2021, presumably, right? This is children going back to school. We also show the same figure by education. I think that, and that's the top right one. I think these are really interesting. And what you can see here is that it's really the people who have a college degree or higher that were able to do their paid work from home. And there wasn't a ton of decline in 2021. In the bottom left-hand corner, we're showing the same figure by parental status. The blue line is parents. again, not surprisingly, we see more parents working at home in 2020. And that probably has to do with responsibilities related to children. All right, next slide, please. Okay, in this set of figures, we're really trying to drill down and look at characteristics of the workday. And so the top left figure is focused on work time. So how much time did people spend working based on where they work? The red line is for people who worked at work. The blue line is for people who worked at home. And what you can see is for those people who worked physically at work, there is almost no change in the amount of time that they spend working on a daily basis. For the people who are working at home, we see this increase. And we did some additional analyses where we're limiting this to people who are working like 4 or more hours a day. And the difference between people working at home and at work is much smaller. But these are just population averages. The top right figure shows the workday span. Essentially, this is sort of the difference between when people start working and when they end working. And again, people at work are in red. There's essentially no difference. Their work days didn't change that much. For the folks in blue, the at-home workers, we can see that the workday got longer during COVID compared to 2019, and then again in 2021. And then we just looked at start times and end times of paid work, and those are in the bottom row. And what you can see is, again, in red for the people at work, essentially no change. And for the people who worked at home, start times for people who worked at home in 2019 were about 10 o'clock in the morning on average. And that's really gone down in 2020 and 2021 as more people are working at home who have, sort of more standard work schedules. And then the end time is pretty consistent for people at work in red and people who are working at home in blue at about 5:30 p.m. So these are averages. There's, of course, variation on this. One of the next ideas is to look at, especially for families, people who are sort of working during the day, doing their parenting, and then working after the kids go to bed, and trying to think about who that group might be. All right, next slide, please. So those are just a couple of examples of things that we're doing, looking at time use during the pandemic. There's a lot of work happening on this topic. If you do a Google Scholar search or look at the IPUMS bibliography, you'll find other things. But now we're going to shift and talk specifically about the well-being module data that accompany the American Time Use Survey. So the well-being module was funded in 2010, 12, 13, and 2021. And in this module, people are asked to rate their happiness, meaning, sadness, stress, pain, and fatigue for 3 randomly selected activities. And these measures reflect momentary emotions felt during activities done at specific times of day and in specific contexts. Again, this excludes sleeping and grooming. It does include paid work. That's a typo. But you can really look at that context. So what were people doing? Who were they with? And where were they? And how is that context related to their assessments of happiness, meaning, sadness, etc. There's also information on self-reported health and life satisfaction. And these global measures have robust negative associations with physical and mental health. So we think they're also pretty useful. So next slide, please. I wanted to quickly show you a little bit more about those momentary well-being measures. The exact question for happiness in this case is, how happy did you feel during this time. People rate their happiness on a 0 to 6 scale. So like essentially not happy at all to very happy. And at the bottom, you can just see a screenshot. These are the assessments of well-being that we have information on in the data. All right, next slide, please. And this is this slide is essentially showing the time diary again. And this is just a made-up example, but you can see here that for 3 randomly selected activities, the first is traveling to the train station in the car alone. The second is working at work with coworkers. And the third is traveling to a restaurant on foot and with coworkers. And for these 3 randomly selected activities, people would be asked to report those 6 emotions. Like, how are they feeling during those activities? So you can look, for example, at how people feel during time spent with coworkers when they're working versus when they're walking to a restaurant, or when they're traveling alone in the car versus traveling on foot with their coworkers. You can use this variation to understand well-being. So the well-being data are only ever asked for 3 activities per person, and they're randomly selected. Okay, next slide, please. So because the ATUS well-being data were collected in 2010, 12, and 13, we already know a fair amount about well-being prior to the pandemic using these data. So we know, for example, that experienced well-being was higher in leisure and lower in paid work, housework, and physical care of children. Right? We can compare well-being across activities prior to the pandemic. And we also know that people who were, that employed people experienced lower well-being than people who were unemployed. And that mothers experienced lower well-being than fathers, but mothers and fathers both really reported lots of happiness and meaning when they were doing activities with their children compared to activities that they did without their children. So this is sort of the backdrop, and this sets us up for analyses of change. So what happens during COVID when people spent a lot more time with kids and they were out of their homes less than they were prior to COVID. So next slide, please. So these are some of the opportunities related to subjective well-being before and during the pandemic. So did subjective well-being decrease or increase during the pandemic, both overall, and you could look at during certain activities or with certain types of people or in certain locations. And again, you could bring in other contextual data and link them with these data to look at how that well-being varies based on stay-at-home orders or COVID infection rates or occupational characteristics, right? So were people in nursing or were they academics? That might matter for how they were feeling during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're back to examples of work that Liana and colleagues and I are doing using looking at changes in well-being across the 2010 to 2021 period. These are analyses that are based on well-being module data collected prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, focused on parents ages 22 to 55 with a co-resident child under 18. We're doing these comparisons by gender and specific activities. The take home here is that there's quite a bit of continuity in how time is spent. And sorry, this is time use. This is a setup for the next slide. Quite a bit of continuity in how parents are spending their time, except if you look at the middle row on the right, leisure, we see that there was a a big reduction in leisure for fathers and mothers during COVID compared to the pre-COVID period. And so our question in this paper is really, how do changes in time use relate to changes in well-being? So next slide, please. And what we see are for the 6 indicators of well-being, we're showing results by gender. So fathers are on the left, mothers are on the right. The red bars are pre-COVID, the blue bars are COVID. And we're seeing similar levels of meaning and happiness in the top row, and sadness in the middle left. But we see differences in stress. So that's in the middle on the right-hand side. We find that both that mothers are reporting more stress during the pandemic, and we also see differences in fatigue, which is the bottom left, and mothers and fathers are both reporting more fatigue during the pandemic. All right, next slide, please. This is a paper where we're comparing happiness and stress prior to and during the pandemic. We're looking at people of all ages based on who they're with and their living arrangements. So the top row here is looking at happiness, and the bottom row is looking at stress. On the left are comparisons by who people are with. And I know this is a little bit small, but on the top left, the leftmost results are comparing people who are alone, and we see that their happiness is lower than everyone else's happiness. And we don't really see differences by the pandemic for people who are alone during the activity. But interestingly, the second set of coefficients, thanks, Liana, actually here, shows that people who are with household family members experience less happiness during the pandemic compared to prior to the pandemic. All right. If you look at the results in the top right, we see that right, people who lived alone, those are the results on the very left, experienced less happiness. And the results are probably not significant here, but they look to be experiencing a little bit less happiness during the pandemic compared to prior to the pandemic. In the bottom left, there are decreases in stress during the pandemic based on who people are with. And then on the right-hand side, this is stress by living arrangements, and we see quite a bit of similarity between the pre-pandemic and pandemic period. All right, next slide, please. All right, so we've talked about what's in the data and what you can, and showed you some examples of what you can do with the data, but I want to briefly mention what's not in the data. So we don't have information about attitudes. For example, like, how did people feel about masking or social contact during the pandemic? We don't know those things. We only can look at their behavior. We also don't know about the quality of relationships. So we don't know if people were were married to a spouse that they like or not. And we also don't know what people were doing beyond who, what, when, and where they were. So we don't really have any motivation for those activities, for example. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so if this was interesting and you would like to use IPUMS time use data to study something about how time use or well-being changed during the pandemic compared to earlier years, or even as we come out of the pandemic, We invite you to use IPUMS Time Use. The data, we ask that you cite the data as well. Based on citations, we are able to show that the data are being used and able to continue to get money to make the data available in this format. It gives us resources to do webinars like this, to do trainings, to support the use of the data, right? To answer questions that you might have and write into us for answers about. And so when you cite the data, it really just allows us to point to wonderful examples of the research that people are doing with the data and to be able to get more money to keep doing this work. At the very bottom, I just want to point out that if you ever find a mistake in the data, let us know. We will confirm that this is indeed a mistake and you will earn an IPUMS mug. These are very coveted in some circles, perhaps yours. That's our reward to you for helping us make the data better. And before we end, I just want to let you all know that in a couple of weeks, we will be having virtual office hours where my colleagues and I will be on Zoom. You can join us and ask us any questions you might have about these data. I believe that is on November 1st, but we can share that information with you if you are interested. So next slide. We are ready for any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Liana. That was a wonderful presentation. If anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or feel free to put something in the chat and I will ask your question. One question I wanted to start off with, could you point folks to any specific training resources or replication packages for working with the well-being data? I know venturing into the well-being data and how to model it can be daunting for first-time users. So if you have anywhere that you could point interested parties to give them examples of working with the data, that would be great.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of training resources and at least one replication package that I have that I can share. I will have to locate
because
those.
I've looked at that replication package.
I will locate those and share them with you, Jen, and maybe you can share them with everyone else.
Questions for our panelists? I will not answer this one. I will throw that out, but I do know the answer. Can non-US researchers access IPUMS data?
Yeah. Anybody who registers at IPUMS can access the data. It doesn't matter where you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'll just, I just wanted to add that registration is easy. We're basically just asking you for your email address and your institution and your career stage so that we can report these things to our funders, and you have immediate approval once you register.
Yes, as a user, I will say very quick to register, very easy to use. The team has done a wonderful job of making this data very user-friendly. Hao Ming.
Hello, thanks. So I'm Hao Ming. I'm assistant professor of sociology at Case Western Reserve. So I have two questions because I've been working on a couple projects about COVID and time use. It's basically like clarifying questions. I really appreciate the virtual work hours at IPUMS. So the first one is I've been playing with the working from home location data for different years. And what I've noticed is the working from home is not as high as expected. So I think one might be it's on weekday. What I did is just I used ATUS X and I chose the activities and I chose the location, whether it's at home, at workplace, or any other places. I just want to make sure that what I did was right. And the second question I had was based on a working paper, I believe, from the speakers in here. It's about which months of data to use to compare. So what I currently do is just use the May to December for 2020 and to use the full year data to the other years and use the respective weight, because there's a 2 weight variables. I just used the WT20 for the partial year data and used the 06 for the other years. I believe this might be shared questions for other audiences as well, so just asking in here. Thank you.
Sarah, you want to take those? Or do you want
Sure.
me?
So in terms of working at home, what I heard you say was that you used the variable builder to create measures of time spent working at home, time spent working at work, and time spent working other places. That's exactly what I do. And I think, you know, I guess I'm not terribly surprised that you're not seeing as high of estimates of working at home as you would expect. I think in our world, lots of people are working at home, but in the bigger world, that's not quite as common, right? We are quite privileged in that respect. I have a paper coming out, Haoming, that I showed the results from that I can share with you in case you want to compare estimates. But I will say that we've done a lot of validation on that time use variable builder, and I'm confident that it's working properly. So I think the data are good. The second question was about which sets of months to use when you're using the 2020 data. So one thing that we didn't get into here is that ATUS data collection was interrupted during the pandemic. So between March and May, there were no interviews collected. And so you have essentially January through March data, and then you have sort of May through December data. And Haoming's question was, I think there were kind of two there. Which data should I use when I'm thinking about 2020, and which weight should I use? I think it depends on your question. If you want to generate something that looks like an annual estimate from the 2020 data, you should use all of the months that are available. If you want to focus in on that COVID period, I personally think it's okay to limit your analyses to May to December of 2020. And Liana, do you want to weigh in on that?
I think I agree with what you just said. Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of the weight, like Haoming said, there is a different weight for the 2020 data, and that's because the interrupted data collection, and we call that WT20 in IPUMS, and all of the other years have a weight that's called WT06. And I think the right step there, Haoming, is just to recode those so that they have the same variable name, and you can use a single weight across time.
Great. And we have two related questions in the chat, and this moves us a little bit into the ATUS territory. So is the international time use data based on existing data overseas, or is the data collected directly by IPUMS? And is it possible to use this data to compare with other countries?
Okay, I can take these. So IPUMS doesn't collect data. So all of the international time use data is data collected either by the Federal Statistical Agency in the country or by researchers in that country. And you'll notice that we have data from some countries for a long time period. We have data from other countries for only very select time periods. I'll mention Germany because we would love to have the most recent German time use data, but they don't want to share it with us for some reason. So sometimes there's data out there that you can access, but we won't have it in IPUMS, not because we are not trying really hard to get that data, but because there are some concerns by the agency. But all of the data is collected by other agencies or researchers. And then it is definitely possible to use the international time use data to compare the US with other countries or compare a subset of other countries. That is one of the major reasons that we wanted to incorporate the international data in IPUMS time use to make that easier for people to do.
I just wanted to piggyback on Liana's response. So we talked about the American Time Use Survey data today. We have a separate data access system for the international data where the American data have been coded, harmonized with the international data so that you can analyze or select data from whatever countries you're interested in across whatever time period. And all of those data will be consistently coded and sort of ready for you to do your work. So if you want international data, you should look at IPUMS MTUS.
Additional questions from the audience? If not, I'll jump in with another question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the potential with linking the ATUS to the CPS. And CPS supplements, and maybe some examples of what folks have been doing with that linkage?
Sure. So technically, it's quite simple to link the American Time Use Survey and the current population survey conveniently for users. At IPUMS, we make both the CPS and the ATUS data available. And so we have put the same linking key on both data sets. So what you would need to do is get a data set from CPS, get a data set from ATUS, and merge them together. With that single linking key, I'll just make a note quickly to, we did a webinar on linking CPS and ATUS data, so I will send that along. And one of the, an example of recent research that I've seen using linked CPS and time use data is by Dan Hammermesh looking at widowhood. So he's looking at people who have recently become widows. Other people, including myself, have linked the ATUS to the CPS annual social and economic supplement because that CPS supplement contains a measure of self-reported health, which is not available in the ATUS in all years. So if we link back to the CPS, we can get information on health and look at how that's related to time use. Liana, are any examples coming to your mind quickly?
No, I'm sorry. I was actually looking for the workshop so I could drop that in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So I was multitasking. Okay.
And people have also used these data to look at non-response because of the linkage between the CPS and the ATUS. You know a lot about the people who were invited to participate in the ATUS but didn't. And so folks have looked at like whether people are whether volunteers are more likely to respond to the American Time Use Survey. Turns out they are.
Also, are people who don't respond, or are people who respond likely to be more or less busy? That was looked at, right, by Catherine Abraham and some colleagues.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say linkages to the current population survey are underutilized and are it's an opportunity ripe for the taking.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do we have maybe a final question from the audience? From what I'm seeing in the chat, it sounds like there is a request for just more resources, more links. And it sounds like Sarah and Liana will be getting that to me. We will post the recording. Usually it's up within a few days. It'll just be right on the WFRN website under the virtual conference series where you originally saw the information. A recording will appear, and under that recording, and Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we can also include some additional links to training materials, so folks can know where to go right there. atusdata.org, training materials, a great site. So we'll make sure that everybody has links to the resources they need if they want to jump in and get going with this data. All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah and Liana, for giving us this wonderful presentation and letting us know about all these wonderful possibilities with the ATUS data. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity to share that information, Jen.
And thanks for your
Bye,
attention.
everybody.
Bye.